Hello, and welcome back to Movie Remake Time, a Filmmaker's Compass podcast, where we're going to look at sequels, reboots, and remakes and ask the simple question, who did it better? I'm CP. This is my amazing co-host, D-Man. D-Man, how have you been?
Actually, pretty good. I love the outfit you had on in preparation for the movie.
I figured it was appropriate.
Yeah, you're rocking the appropriate digs. So I may have to step up my game, see what I have in my closet, in my wardrobe, if I can join the show, you know? So if you want to go ahead and introduce the movie, it's one that I know you personally are very excited about. I had seen both of these movies prior, but it had been a while. And so upon rewatch, I was very excited to get to talk about it.
Fantastic. Obviously, we just had G.I. Joe Origins Snake Eyes released in the movie theaters. So D-Man and I thought this was the perfect opportunity to look at the other two G.I. Joe films, G.I. Joe, The Rise of Cobra from 2009, and G.I. Joe Retaliation from 2013, both of which G.I. Joe movies and kind of a soft reboot, which we get another reboot in G.I. Joe Snake Eyes. So there's going to be a ton for us to talk about today. And we hope that all you G.I. Joe fans are going to join in the conversation and let us know your thoughts.
All right. Well, you know, what's interesting when looking at those two films straight up is, like you said, it is a direct sequel, but also kind of a soft reboot where you can tell that the producers wanted to, you know, replace some of the characters from the first one, whether that was contractual, you know, whatever happened. So even though it is a sequel, some of the characters pick up in the same places. It is kind of a soft reboot. So to that end, right, what do you think G.I. Joe Rise of Cobra brought to the table initially? And do you think it lived up to the kind of cultural aspirations of the toy line and the cartoon from like the 80s and the 90s?
Okay, that's a big question. First of all, shout out to Stephen Sommers, who directed the Mummy franchise and came on board as the original director of the G.I. Joe Rise of Cobra. I think G.I. Joe Rise of Cobra really had an identity crisis to begin with, and I know we'll get into this later. Hasbro wanted to make this film almost a decade earlier with the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. They didn't want to make a war-glorifying film, so they shifted focus into Transformers and kind of came back to G.I. Joe. So it was already on this rocky footing to begin with. I think that the original storyline tried to introduce these characters. I think that the big failure was really kind of two things. One, this is a film setting up a universe. And the problem is the two sequels don't exactly take place in the same universe in the same way. So they lay out a ton of information as opposed to just focusing on what would be a really cool movie where you have G.I. Joe's, Cobra Commander, everyone fighting, you know, to take over the world and save the world and do all this cool action stuff. Two, I think there was the other problem of, again, the decision not to be perceived as a film glorifying war. Rise of Cobra focuses on weird, like, chase scenes and shark submarine sequences, and it doesn't feel like a true G.I. Joe movie, which a lot of fans at the time were really bummed because they said, first of all, you don't give us G.I. Joe, but on top of it, you have changed origin stories of characters and backstories in a way that's not consistent with all the canon.
Now, and that's what I was kind of getting at, is if you go back, so the original toy line of G.I. Joe is from, I don't know what, the 50s, 60s?
I think the 60s.
And it's the kind of like doll-looking G.I. Joes. They're pretty big. They're not the action figures necessarily that everyone has come to love, although, ironically, that original line gave rise to the popular phrase action figure.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is it was the 1980s line, Real American Hero, where they introduced like the 3.75 action figures, kind of similar to Star Wars action figures. And those were the ones that really embodied the characters that we came to see in Rise of Cobra. Mm-hmm. So those are the lines that have been celebrated with, you know, 25th anniversaries and all of that type stuff. And then that's also the line that the An American Hero cartoon was based off of. that
Yeah.
has, the famous theme song and all of that.
Yes.
G.I. Joe, you know,
Yes, dude.
real American hero. Um, so it's interesting because you can see the parallels here between Rise of Cobra and that product line. And culturally speaking, I think it does still resonate with the public because we grew up with those characters, right? We were probably adults coming of age. And like you said, the identity crisis of the film is that it's not addressing that direct canon and creating a movie for the people who grew up with the line. It felt a little bit like they were reintroducing G.I. Joe, hopefully to another, how do I say it? Action figure buying age group.
Yes.
That's what they were trying to do. They weren't trying to make a movie for the people who grew up with and loved G.I. Joe as the action figures, as the animated show, and in the comics. And like you said, there's a large canon here. Some of these characters are really beloved. Snake Eyes, Storm Shadow,
Duke.
Yeah, Duke, very popular. I mean, there's even been video games and things like that. So this is like kind of a big, expansive world. And there was some palpable excitement for a G.I. Joe film at the time, because we're talking in the same area, same time frame as movies like Iron Man, where they had introduced some comic book characters, that maybe weren't of the highest profile at the time, to great success.
Yeah.
So people thought it was possible that G.I. Joe could actually step in here and kind of be like not a superhero movie, because the Joes don't have any like quote unquote superpowers, although they're skilled in different areas of combat and tech and all this different stuff. But I think they were hoping that they were going to get kind of like an Iron Man film that would really introduce a strong stable of characters in the first movie, and then kind of expand that universe outward as they went on. But I think, like you said, the problem was they tried to cram way too much into 1 2-hour film, and it feels that way. Yeah. You can tell the characters aren't getting proper introductions. They're just doing like a little flashback to be like, oh, that's where you came from. And even some of the creation of like, Cobra Commander and Destro and all that at the end of the film, they feel a little just kind of like rushed in, because they were like, hey, we wanted to show you guys how these characters came about. But like you said, if you do it right, you can just start with them already mysterious and there.
I'm going to actually pull the U card on this one and say, let's look at Star Wars, right? Star Wars has the perfect model here. We introduced the character of Darth Vader, and he's shrouded in mystery. But the fact is, he walks on screen. He's an imposing force. He's a total badass. You could have done the same thing with Cobra Commander or Destro, right? They are characters already created to fill that mold of tons of mystery. They have an imposing presence. They have these things that set them apart. Yeah. And why did we need to dive into their history? Just put it on screen. Let us see who this Cobra Commander badass dude is. And we can spend the rest of a trilogy figuring out who they are and unpacking those characters.
I'll join you on a comparison right here, but I'm going to go with another 80s toy line, and that's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. In the first movie, Shredder comes on screen and he is imposing. He's very scary. He is that character already fully in the flesh. We don't need kind of an origin story, although there is a past that's alluded to in the film that kind of allows us to understand what the relationships are between the characters. But the Shredder is fully formed and there and scary and intimidating. When he walks down and they have that long shadow shot, I was like, oh my God, this guy's really, you could tell a little bit they're playing off, that kind of, I guess, Darth Vader imagery, right? He's got the helmet and the cape. But at the same time, as a toy line, we're already familiar, right? They're making the movie for the people who liked the toys. And again, the comics in that case came first. But, there's a group of people, and that movie, if you actually watch Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, is kind of like adult. It's not necessarily the kiddiest film, especially considering the different variations we've seen of the Turtles. And
you're absolutely right.
With G.I. Joe, I felt like they went a little bit, not kiddie. It's not a kiddie film, but I mean, I guess I just use the word safe instead of trying to actually craft out this world and all of this stuff. I feel like they played it a little safe there.
I would agree. I think the better example of what Hasbro should have tried to do was what they did with Transformers. Hey, if you're an original Transformers fan, you'll enjoy these movies. There's these characters that you love. Yet there's opportunities to introduce them to new kids. I would not consider the original couple Transformers movies as necessarily for kids or for adults. It's kind of a good hybrid where you can have a multi-generational audience in the movie watching it. And that's something that the Rise of Cobra really failed at.
Yeah, you know, and again, culturally, G.I. Joe was still relevant. So we're not even talking about having to dig up an old property that people aren't familiar with today, that only like a bunch of, you know, old cinephiles or action figure collectors would know. You're like, no, G.I. Joe is still on, you know, Toys R Us shelves at that time, RIP. Yep. And, you know, it's still around. So it's strange to me that they went that route. But okay, so that's Rise of Cobra. But let's take a look now at Retaliation culturally. So it's kind of drawing on a larger mythos, you know, and canon from the comics to, like you said, soft reboot the characters. Now, do you think they're bringing in The Rock? And we've already had this conversation with Fast and the Furious. You know, culturally speaking, do you think The Rock elevates the profile of Retaliation and kind of gives it a little bit more legitimacy as maybe an action film? Or do you think The Rock kind of fell victim to, you know, the G.I. Joe way of doing things?
That's a good question. And first of all, actually, I want to share a story. So the director of this film, John Chu, I actually met him when I was a high school student. Oh, wow. I went to an event about going to USC Film School, and I actually had this awesome 2-hour conversation with him right when he graduated. And he was talking about how he had just met Steven Spielberg and his big hopes to be a director. So when I went to see this movie in the theater, it was very cool being like, oh, I met that guy. Like, he's really cool and he's finally doing it. So aside.
That is awesome.
I think that the smartest thing they did in the G.I. Joe franchise was actually bring The Rock in as a character. Okay. For one, when you watch the Rise of Cobra, in many ways is lacking leadership, right? From the side of the Joes. No offense to Marlon Wayans and, you know,
Dennis Quaid
and Channing Tatum. It doesn't feel like there's a guy that everybody's looking to as who's the Leonardo of the team, who's the guy that's going to call the shots.
Yeah.
And so bringing in The Rock, you have that guy with the instant, you know, the credibility, right? He seems like an action star. He seems like a hero. And that's something that I think the G.I. Joe core of characters definitively needed.
Sure.
So I think it was really smart. The second thing that I actually think was brilliant in many ways was the decision to actually kill off Channing Tatum as Duke.
Okay.
This is a dude who, when they were in the middle of promoting G.I. Joe Rise of Cobra, came out publicly saying he didn't want to be involved in the movie because he didn't want to do something which glorified, you know, war and combat. And I'm like, okay,
well, then
dude,
why did he even sign
why
up
did
for
you
it?
sign up to be Duke, you know, this American hero, this, you know, soldier extraordinary, if you weren't into it? So, and later he said he actually wanted to be written out of the franchise because he didn't want to be shackled to it. So I think from a casting perspective, I'm like, this is a dude who is not all in. Whereas repeatedly, and I mean, obviously actors change, but The Rock has brought up many times that he would be willing to come back for future G.I. Joe movies. In fact,
and maybe
Bruce Willis has said the same thing. So I think that from the perspective of the producers, it was important to bring in someone who seemed a little more excited and invested about the franchise, but also brought that presence to the characters.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I feel like with the addition of The Rock, that's exactly what you got, was a little bit more presence, not necessarily star power, but you got, you know, the big bulky guy, somebody who can step in and be like, you know, let's face it, I'm The Rock.
Yeah.
And that was lacking in the first one because the way Duke and Ripcord are presented is like, they're still like going through training. Yeah, they're like tag-alongs. They're not even like, I guess, again, it's kind of like weird because it's like, they're not even quote unquote like G.I. Joes yet. Like, they're borderline getting shoehorned in because Duke basically forced their hand. So it's not, you know, from a story standpoint, they're not necessarily the leaders of the Joes or, you know, even in good standing, really.
Yeah.
So it is kind of lacking that. And then it's weird because they almost, in order to make the death of Duke impactful, I feel like they shoehorn that in, where at the beginning of Retaliation, they kind of keep hinting at like, he's such a good soldier and a good friend and all this stuff. I was like, well, you never really showed it on screen. So
it's unearned, right? Totally unearned, but hey.
Yeah, I guess they had to get rid of him. So I don't know. I would rather, the thing about G.I. Joe though is, I mean, even I wouldn't even mind if they just, added another character named Duke and just said like, this guy took up the moniker and we're just going to go with like the original character's origin story.
I mean, right. And even within like G.I. Joe canon, right, they did that with Snake Eyes. So it's been done before. You could have done the same thing, and I don't think audiences would have cared. It may have solved them the problem of having to constantly sort of reboot this property.
Yeah, which I guess, from a cultural standpoint, we do tire of reboots. I think the perfect example was like Spider-Man, where they kept redoing this kind of origin story. And everybody was kind of like, hey, listen, we have seen this origin story like 3 or 4 times now. If you go back to some of the comic and cartoons from the 90s, then you have, even Spider-Man 3 with Tobey Maguire kind of like readdresses the Uncle Ben thing. And then they do it again. And so I don't know, it was weird because you can see the public kind of tire of that. And I think that's why when Marvel introduced Spider-Man into the MCU, they just said, we're not doing any of that. In fact, it's, his origin story is slightly different, although not really, it's just not explored on screen. But they're like, hey, let's just move past that. And Spider-Man's here and he's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I don't know. It's weird because I keep, as we look at Rise of Cobra versus Retaliation and kind of this, can we get like a pure G.I. Joe movie? Because right, Snake Eyes is another origin story.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me a little bit of like, you have Batman Begins, which was actually a fantastic origin film.
Yeah.
And then you shift and you actually see the Dark Knight and it's Batman and it's like Batman Prime. And at the end of the day, that's the movie everyone wants. And that's probably where the best stories actually are. Get the origin stuff out of the way. Yeah, get to the real story. I would love to see something that, they're really exploring some of the depth and courage and, moral dilemmas of war that some of these characters have to face. And I don't know. I just, the way the franchise is right now, it's like Rise of Cobra origin. Retaliation, soft reboot. Snake Eyes, reboot and origin. I'm like, can we just get to the G.I. Joes? Like, let's go. Can we get to Prime?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So otherwise, culturally speaking, I don't know that any of the actors per se, the G.I. Joe roles are defining roles in their careers the same way that like, Christian Bale can't go anywhere without, everyone knowing he's Batman. I don't know that there was, a whole lot that stood out from either film that I was like, hey, this is like a cultural touchstone moment. Like a perfect example. I don't even know if you've seen the movie in its entirety, but I know I've showed you the scene is like, even if you didn't care very much for Star Wars Rogue One, that Darth Vader scene was like a cultural touchstone moment. Like everyone was like, hey, you got to go see Darth Vader.
Yeah.
Go do it. Just do yourself the favor, sit through the rest of the movie, which is actually pretty good. So you're not going to hate yourself. But when you get to go see that scene in the theater, they're like, it's amazing. I don't think these movies got to any of that level where we were, you and I would have water cooler moment where I'm like, dude, you got to go check this out.
Yeah.
Because even comparatively, again, you look at like the Mission Impossible films and the stunts that Tom Cruise is doing. He's doing that intentionally for a reason because it gives each film this kind of real big thing to promote about it. And then when you go see it and it delivers, they're quite impressive.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So I don't know, culturally, I think the G.I. Joe films, they didn't necessarily stick around. I'm assuming that's why they're rebooting it to Snake Eyes now. And hopefully it's something that won't be rebooted again. I hope whatever they're going to do next, they just bite the bullet. If Snake Eyes doesn't do well, don't reboot it. Just move
It seems
forward.
like from what I saw, an audience, if you saw Snake Eyes chime in, it seems like they are laying the foundations for this greater G.I. Joe universe and essentially the terrorist organization that's Cobra and the Joes who are stopping them. So hopefully we are on track now for a coherent, consistent set of Joe films.
All right. Well, I haven't seen Snake Eyes, so I'll take your word for
it. I think we got to talk about effects.
Okay.
Because when I look at Rise of Cobra versus Retaliation, that's one of the big differences I notice. Aside from the people on the screen, it's really what's happening. What are the sequences they're involved with? And obviously, we understand that Rise of Cobra was in 2009, but by the time 2009 had come around, we had some pretty amazing visual effects, right?
Iron Man was great.
Iron Man, this is almost the same, you know, this is like a year before the Avenger films.
Oh, yeah.
And we're watching Rise of Cobra. And I even remember in the theaters being kind of disappointed in the quality of the visual effects. It feels much more 90s. And even the fact that I think they said they brought in like 5 different effects studios to manage the workload. You know, it's really weird because one of them did just all the nanite sequences. And the nanite sequences, like eating the Eiffel Tower, look really good. Then there's sequences where there's planes and aircraft carriers and flying past pyramids that look like almost as though a high school student had rendered them. And I'm just like,
they're out of The Mummy from 99.
Exactly. And I'm like, Paramount, this is really what you're going to stand by. You weren't like, you know what, let's just throw in an extra $50 million, whatever it takes to really bring these visual effects up to par.
Yeah, you know, the big differences for me, so there's really 2. One is in the overall aesthetic of the film. The first one feels much more, I guess, comic booky. And the second one, Retaliation, feels much more grounded in realism. And I think you can see that in the actual weapons that they're doing. One is like nanites and they're green and you know, that's an off color, right?
And pulse rifles and...
Yeah, and then the second one's like, you know, pulse rifles, but more realistic. It feels, I guess, a little bit more like, you know, like kind of like a James Bond weapon or something. And when you actually see the sequence where they hit London, it was actually, I thought it was pretty good.
No, it's night and day between the two. And again, you know, when you watch,
I don't know why they want to destroy all these European cities, but
I don't know, man. When you watch Retaliation too, there's much more of a practical element in the sense that the explosions and things feel like they're really happening. Whereas again, when you compare the ambush sequence to Rise of Cobra, when Baroness shows up to steal the warheads, to the sequence where the military shows up to wipe out the Joes, night and day. One of them looks like a blockbuster film in Retaliation. The other one leaves you really wanting more.
Well, and that's also the second thing I was going to say is it's reflected in the kind of fighting styles. You know, again, in Rise of Cobra, it's kind of flashy and they're like, you know, doing all kinds of like, I don't know, like exaggerated attacks. They're just, you know, doing like they have the, what is it? Duke and Ripcord in the metal suits. Like,
chasing down the truck or whatever.
Yeah, like everything feels a little bit more exaggerated, where when you look at Retaliation, the fighting style feels much more like brute force. Like these are 2 people actually fighting. Where, I don't know, I guess in the first one, it just felt a little bit more like they're trying to go for that like superhero vibe. And I was like, I don't know how well it's playing off, because they keep trying to like enhance these people to make them do extraordinary things, where I'm like, the thing with G.I. Joe, realize what you got. It's not these superheroes. They're real soldiers that have certain skill sets, but I'd like to see that explored a little bit more. And I feel like Retaliation does that better.
I would agree.
And you could feel it. So, but yeah, in terms of effects, the biggest standout to me was just the color, like almost the color grading. One of them felt, again, like they're using vibrant colors and they're, you know, let's make sure that if something's going to blow up, it's like green and it has these comic booky kind of flashpoints, where the other one felt like they're using like a military palette. Yeah. They're actually kind of starting to, you know, embrace the type of story that it should be. And I felt like Retaliation does that slightly better.
Yeah, the color grading looks almost exactly like the first two Transformer films.
Yeah, right. Like it's really flashy, and I was like, I understand what they're going for. I think it just kind of undermined our perception of these as like extraordinary soldiers. Now they just, I don't know, they felt more superhero like to me, and now I think that's what they were trying to go for.
Fair enough.
So one of the other things I wanted to ask you about is, so the music. Again, we've talked about this in the past, that the movie doesn't leave you with a theme in your head where you're like humming it, or they kind of almost embrace this like rock action type. I think that was Retaliation, and the first one felt more, I guess, like, I don't know, lame. There's not much there. It's just music to put over your action sequences. I was like, it's not memorable. And I felt like, again, when you have G.I. Joe, it's not that you need a character theme. You need that overarching kind of Avengers theme that, like, maybe when the Joes assemble at the end, and I know I had used that word, probably shouldn't have, stealing it right from the Avengers. But I mean,
it's ironic because both movies actually have that team assembled visual moment, right? Where all the Joes that we're following all get together and they walk towards the camera and we're like, cool, they're about to go kick some ass. And you're right. That's the moment where you need the theme and they don't have it. And I think what's really criminal about it is, I mean, you were singing it earlier. There is a G.I. Joe theme that we already know and relate to the G.I. Joes. Why not update that, change that, build that into a more of a score that we'd walk out of the theaters, humming to ourselves?
And it just feels lacking. It feels like, you know what? I don't know who they got to score it or what their intentions were. But again, it's like, Paramount, shell out the money and go get the guy who's going to create you a theme song. Like, do it. The movie needs it. The team needs it. So that when those moments hit, we're all like, ooh, yes. Like, I even remember there was a scene in, and it's weird, in the Harry Potter series where they actually get away from the traditional kind of Harry Potter music that was so iconic in the first couple films, and they abandon it. But in the last movie, when like Harry and them come into the Gryffindor common room, they play it. And I remember the audience reaction was like breathing like life into, kind of, at this point, it was somewhat, lifeless. Like, all of a sudden you could feel the magic. People, they got, they just got like, that tingly feeling you get when theme music comes on, and everybody's like, yes, we kind of cheered like they did in the common room that Harry was there. We're like, oh my God, here we go. And the G.I. Joe, I mean, in order to really reach that, if they're going to try to compete with, the MCU and some of these other movies, because I think that's their target audience. Yeah.
I would agree. I mean, it's probably the same nerdy comic book fans that want to see them. You're shelling out the same type of things, these sort of action films with a sci-fi fantasy element. I would think it's the exact same audience between the two.
Yeah. And we've seen, as far as like, so if we get into the story now, we've seen, really intriguing like war movies or missions and things like that, even to the extent that, a movie like James Bond or Mission Impossible, we're following kind of like a super spy. But, I mean, you could take elements of those movies and apply it to a team. I mean, Mission Impossible basically shifts the entire franchise to do that later, even though they're not like tech, quote unquote, like military.
Yeah.
I could see, really kind of getting into some elements like that, where you're embracing that kind of very realistic type action, yet you also have these kind of like James Bond crazy villains. And because, James Bond they're always known for their villains.
Well, and I think, again, Retaliation does that a little bit better, right? We have this master of disguise in Zartan who is impersonating the president. They bring in a couple other characters with a little eccentric qualities. You still have Cobra Commander and Storm Shadow, but more importantly, I think the major story beat that or approach that they take in Retaliation is, we're going to scale it down it's just a group of 5 Joes against the world. They can't even trust their own government, which I think sets itself up much better, because then you're like, okay, it's just this small group of people trying to do the impossible. Where the first one, it's this secret multi-government agency versus this secret shadow agency with bases under the polar ice caps. And it just feels so big that you don't really believe it in any way.
Yeah, I could see that. And the thing too is, like, they go to great lengths both times to have their villains essentially want to destroy cities to just show how powerful they are so they can take over the world. I mean, I kind of felt that to be somewhat of a weak villain story. I did, however, find Cobra Commander in Retaliation to be much more intimidating as a villain.
I would agree.
I definitely felt his presence when he was on screen. So however they could kind of keep that going would be interesting. But I found their motives, for the whole kind of movie to be lacking. Like, even in Retaliation, which it's set up at the end of Rise of Cobra, but essentially they're like, oh, you kidnapped and impersonating the president of the United States. I'm like, that's not very believable. Like,
yeah, right.
Yeah, I guess. But it's like you have to just take that as like that could happen. I'm like, I don't know. I don't think that would happen.
No, you're right. They go so big in these movies that it almost it kind of shifts it out of its element, right?
Yeah, and I think too, one of the standouts was not that the characters were needed to make the story engine go, but the lack of continuity between Rise of Cobra and Retaliation, I feel like hurt Retaliation here. The absence of Hawk, of Scarlet, of Ripcord, some of these characters who we'd been invested in the first movie, the kind of tossing aside of Duke.
Mm-hmm.
The only two really standouts who are the same people are Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow. Even Cobra Commander was recast.
Yeah.
I mean, Zartan he's
not
they,
even,
they like a couple glimpses of his face, but I mean, they really recast him. Like, there's the lack of continuity, just like you said, it makes it feel like a soft reboot. And because of that, I feel like the movie suffers because we don't really get where it's going anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Like, even if the first movie wasn't that great, they're introducing these characters for us to kind of get invested in. And it's like the Baroness is gone. Even though Destro is mentioned, he's like in a hyperbolic chamber or whatever. Like, I think the continuity really kind of ruined it, because instead of trying to figure out how to solve those characters and get us to G.I. Joe Prime, they were like, let's just get rid of all of them and we'll introduce some new Joes and see if that works better. And I was like, yeah, but it doesn't feel like a shared universe anymore. It doesn't feel like like you're building to anything.
I would agree.
And I think that really hurt Retaliation, because at the very least, like you said, in the first one, we get the sense that they're trying to lay the groundwork for this bigger shared universe. And it felt like, maybe upon the sequel, they can get the characters right. Maybe they can introduce some more unique internal conflicts and conflicts for the characters. And because even Duke in Rise of Cobra, one of the things that kind of bothered his character was basically like, oh, I was in love with like the Baroness, and he just can't figure out, how to like do this. And me, I have talked about this even in the MCU. They've done this multiple times now, even with the new Black Widow film. I'm not a huge fan of like mind control, or like in this case, like nano, whatever they are.
Yeah. How essentially none of the Cobra people have any free will in Rise of Cobra. They're all slaves.
I hate that because it takes out the internal conflict. Because when you find out, like, oh, the Baroness is just being controlled by her brother, who we thought is dead, but is actually about to become one of the strongest people in the world, which I don't know why. Like,
yeah,
it to me, it undermines it. Like, here she is having these conversations with Duke and alluding to certain things earlier in the film. And I'm like, well, then just throw all those out. If that's not what you really believe, like, then what
Yeah.
the hell?
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. It
So,
was
and then
another way of cheapening these characters and taking away some of the, you know,
yeah,
characterization.
two other story elements that bother me, and they're both in Retaliation, which is ironic. I did not particularly like Storm Shadow's change of sides. Now, I did a little character research, and I know that
He
Storm
does it a
Shadow.
few times.
Yeah, I know his character is known for that. So if you were a fan of the canon, you might have appreciated it. I didn't feel like the movie set it up properly, though. There's nothing through the first movie and half of Retaliation that would make me think that he's secretly trying to destroy Cobra from within. Just, I did not get that vibe at all. And I felt that turn felt a little bit unrealistic. Like they just wanted another strong character, and Storm Shadow was one of everybody's favorite. So they were like, let's bring him to make sure he's like, one of the core hero guys. But I didn't care for it. I didn't care. They did a little retcon with Zartan and his origin story. Wasn't a fan. So I don't know. What about you? Did you like that?
I mean, again, it's kind of as you said. In some ways, they were hamstringed with one of the only consistent characters from both films,
right?
portrayed by the same actor.
Yeah.
You kind of need to pull him in, especially since one of the things I think that they really embraced in the Rise of Cobra, and you talked a little bit about this, was the concept that we have all these characters who are doing cool stuff. All right, cool stuff. They seem to, in Retaliation, just want them to be out there doing physical hand-to-hand combat with weapons, which is kind of something that's a bigger part of the G.I. Joe comic books and the cartoons, right? Anyway, it was never about just shooting people up. It's always much more these people that are actually fighting with skilled combat and knowing martial arts. And the decision to, I think, in some ways, bring Storm Shadow over allowed them to embrace that a lot more than just having Snake Eyes versus Storm Shadow again.
I know. And they almost set it up to be that way, and they turn it. Mm-hmm. And I kind of like that because, again, it's like, I don't know. The irony is like Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow have like this great kind of comic book history. And it gets, I'm sure it gets explored in Snake Eyes, but it's just funny because it's, I wasn't a fan of the story technique of having him. He just, like his sword gets broken and he's like, surprise,
it wasn't me. I told you all
that did it. Yeah. Like what? Yeah. Like everything about your character totally suggests that you did do that. And then you went and joined Cobra. Like it's just, you're telling me that like someone framed you that long ago and they don't even have a motive in the film for why Zartan would even do that. Like it doesn't even make sense, but apparently he did it. And then you spent your entire life infiltrating this secret organization that actually only rose like one movie ago. And like, I don't know. It's just the whole thing to me was odd. I was like, I'm just not feeling it. And
fair enough.
The other element of Retaliation that I wasn't a huge fan of was the use of Bruce Willis. So I love the introduction of the original Joe, but I feel like Bruce Willis was really just, let's just pay this guy to get a big name. And he just says like a couple of one-liners and he has like some witty dialogue. He really plays almost no role. He could have been anybody.
And the thing that blows me away is watching it. They're setting this up for the reveal that he is actually Lady J's father.
Oh, yeah.
Right? As they're playing out, like they have this history. He's this decorated military guy. She talks about how her father didn't approve of women soldiers. You're like, okay, cool. This is a really interesting opportunity for some characterization for her. And then all of a sudden he's just like, nope, I worked with your dad. That's it. Again, it was kind of a missed opportunity, I felt. Now, doing some research, I know that originally he was actually supposed to portray Sergeant Slaughter, who's a very popular Joe.
Oh, yeah.
And there was in some licensing stuff, so they had to change it. I mean,
is that because of like WWE?
So I think so. I think so. Okay. So I don't know what the decision there was. I think it's cool to kind of, again, try and bridge some of that earlier Joe history, which if we have a property going back to the 60s, like I think it's a great idea. But again, I'm with you. It didn't execute in the way that it could have.
he just felt lame duck to me. Even the reveal, like where he like drops down, you're like, oh, it's Bruce Willis. Like it just felt anticlimactic. I don't know. Like they're promoting him. If you look at the posters for Retaliation, you know, he's kind of right there front and center. I don't know. He ended up being a background character. Pretty, yeah, like there you go. Pretty non, you know, important to the story. They just kind of go to him to be like, can we just like use some of your expertise, I guess, right?
Yeah, and again, it's kind of weird because The Rock's character actually has the exact same reasoning. He earlier in the movie, he's like, the only person that we can trust in the world is Snake Eyes. And then 20 minutes later, he's like, the only person we can trust in the world is one man. And it turns out to be Bruce Willis. So again, I'm like, listen, if there's only one person you can trust, then it needs to be only one person that you can trust.
Yeah, I know, right? It can't, yeah, it just can't be these contradictions because they really, you know, kind of weaken the overall story. And I don't know, those elements, you know, even in Retaliation, which I think is trying to better encapsulate the mood of a G.I. Joe film successfully, they still have all these things where I'm like, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
No, absolutely. So listen, all right. I mean, we've talked through it. Verdict time. Which one do you think did it better?
I think I'm going to have to go with Retaliation. And it's more so the fact that that one seems to capture the mood I expect for a G.I. Joe film a little bit better. I think the action scenes were more grounded, but they were a little bit more intense for that reason. You know, watching the characters in the suits chase down a car in Paris, while as exciting as it was, the stakes felt really low to me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, it was cool. I think the effects team, you know, kudos. It didn't feel like they're wearing these suits. I was like, guys, they're gonna bust through walls and do all this stuff. I don't know. Doesn't feel like
you bring up a good point, because I think one of actually the coolest sequences in the original Rise of Cobra is the one where Snake Eyes walks past the sensors.
Oh yeah.
And you're like, okay, this is exactly what it is. It's Snake Eyes can do it not because of the technology that he has, because of who he is, right? The stakes are clear. It's him using his skills and his physical abilities to overcome these obstacles in a way no one imagined. And I think it works really well.
Yeah, so which did it better? I think I'm going to have to go with Retaliation. The cartoony comic booky vibe of the first one kind of turned me off. But yeah, Retaliation has its downsides. Like I said, there's not this kind of continuity between the two that there should be. I feel like they had a chance to really take some of the elements that, you know, worked in the first one, some of the characters, and see if you could not reinvent them, but add the layers and dimension to really make them memorable and not just kind of like, you know, an action figure name. And
I understand.
But yeah, there's just something about the mood, the setting, the color palette. I like the introduction of The Rock, even though on that exact same, I didn't really care for the introduction of Bruce Willis. But I think they got some things right that I felt were better suited to build off of, where the first one just felt, you know, even the introduction, like at the very beginning of the first, you know, G.I. Joe Rise of Cobra, he like shows how these nanobots work or whatever. And I was like, okay, so this is not realistic.
I would agree. I would agree with you. I think Retaliation does it better. Again, it walks more of that Transformers line that I think is what the franchise should do. It's grounded in the realism, as you said. The weapons seem real. It seems like feats that these people could actually do without kind of truly pushing the edge of the science fiction to it, right?
Yeah.
It feels like if there were Joes, they could execute this plan, and this is what this would look like. I think I actually am a big supporter of the recast in most cases, because again, I think it helps ground this in something, and The Rock brought something much needed to the franchise. I'm with you. And I think, unfortunately, the failure of The Rise of Cobra is in many ways the same failure of Retaliation. And it's kind of almost from a macro producer level someone who I don't think that they had a clear plan of what they were trying to do with a franchise and how to execute it.
Yeah. And it shows, obviously they didn't end up, I think there was a desired sequel because they wanted The Rock to take over the reins. They rebooted it with Snake Eyes, and you could tell that they just could never quite figure out what it was they were trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
And as fans, we could sense it too, that, hey, I mean, it's hard, especially when you have Marvel right there at that time, kind of rising through, blowing away fan expectations for what a franchise can be. And then here you have G.I. Joe, where it's like, guys, it just seems like this is like a mess right now.
Mm-hmm.
And we know how good it could be now. We've, by the time you said Retaliation's in 2013, so we've already had Avengers. We're like, oh my gosh, you guys could do something really great.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're just not on that level. And so it shows. And, that's what happens too when someone else sets the bar so high. You look at Marvel and what they've done, even DC, as hard as they're trying not to replicate the MCU, but compete with those movies in that same space. They've had trouble with it because the bar has been set so high, even though the stable, of those characters. And I think that's what G.I. Joe should recognize is they have great characters. And if you want to create this kind of, ongoing series of movies, then really invest in those characters. You don't have to give each one of them an individual movie, but maybe it should be like missions. What they should do is like send certain characters on missions, and then eventually like they all kind of connect into one big
that'd be cool
action film. Something to give it a little bit more weight. And then that way you don't have every single character from all G.I. Joes in every movie, because they can all only get so much screen time.
You're right. And that's another problem, right? There's a lot of characters here.
So I would love to see a movie, not necessarily like Rise of Cobra, but I would love to see maybe an introduction to an overarching thing that introduces G.I. Joe's Prime. And then maybe they break out into like 3 different mission films where you kind of can puzzle piece these elements together. And then they return, and we'll get them a nice theme song.
Oh, Paramount, listen to this guy. He's got a plan.
And then they return for this kind of big epic, showdown of some sort. It would be pretty cool.
No, I agree. It would be awesome. And again, it's kind of a shame because it's such a cool property with such a great history, and it's really expansive. And it's kind of a shame that they have not been able to build this into what it could be on the big screen.
Well, here's to hoping that they can get it right the third time around, And if you guys need help, call me.
So, hey, that's our episode. Let us know your thoughts on Rise of Cobra, Retaliation, Snake Eyes. What do you think about what they're doing wrong with the G.I. Joe universe? Let us know. We'd love to continue the conversation. You can find us at Film Comp Podcast, as Dustin says every week. You can also look for the show, Google us, filmmakerscompass.com. You can find us everywhere that you listen to your podcast, and please leave us a great review. That always helps the show.
Definitely. So we will be back next week. We'll have 2 new movies to review, and we hope you guys will be back with us. Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you next week.